For this list, we'll be going over cards that give you at least a +1 in card advantage, but are just not very useful, even with the advantage they give you, or just too hard to use. And at number 10, we have auto-matic. This is a spell card which has the effect that if it's sent from your hand or field to the graveyard, you get to add 3 monsters from your deck to your hand, one each of Ojama's green, yellow, and black. So this card is potentially a +2 in card advantage, which sounds excellent on paper, and is the perfect card to kind of open this list on, because the 3 cards it allows you to search out from your deck are kind of useless. All 3 of them are just normal monsters with 0 attack, and the archetype they're part of is all about locking out your opponent's field zones and then swapping the attack and defensive monsters in the field with Ojama Country. Although the main problem with this deck and archetype is the fact that it's just not very strong and loses to any tier 2 or above competitive deck. But if you're a huge fan of Ojamas, they did release some support that allowed combining Ojamas with ABC Dragon Buster cards due to Ojama Assimilation, which allows you to banish Ojama monsters in order to special summon the 3 materials for ABC Dragon Buster directly from your deck. And what do you know, this weird gimmick was actually good enough to technically see competitive play once or twice, which is why auto-matic is only at number 10 on this list. It technically saw competitive play a few times, but most of the time it's just a funny gimmick card, an archetype which is very good at granting advantage actually. It's just the advantage is kind of useless most of the time, outside of Ojama Assimilation shenanigans. And at number 9, we have Diamond Dust Cyclone. This is a spell card which has the effect that you can destroy a monster that has 4 or more fog counters on it, and then draw 1 card for every 4 fog counters that were on it. So if you use this on a monster your opponent controls with a whole bunch of fog counters, you have the potential to draw any number of cards from your deck, and easily go above the +1 threshold that is a requirement for a card to make this list. So what's the problem with this card? Cloudian decks specialize in placing fog counters on themselves, not your opponent's monsters, and rarely do they allow them to place 4 or more counters on themselves at a time even, as pretty much all main deck level 4 or lower Cloudian monsters have the effect, where when they're normal summoned, you get to place a number of fog counters on themselves for each number of Cloudian monsters on the field. So unless you have a full board of Cloudians, then you're not placing too many cloud counters on yourself immediately. Cloudians do have a really good continuous spell card called Cloudian Squall, which places 1 fog counter on every face-up monster on the field during both player standby phases. And by really good, I mean good for a counter placing card. It's still not very good since it doesn't do anything immediately, and you have to wait 2 full turns before it places 4 counters on any 1 card, while not doing anything for those entire 2 turns unless you use the fog counters for other things, which would go completely counterintuitive to Diamond Dust Cyclone, as you can't use the card until a monster has at least 4 or more counters on it. They did release some new Cloudian support randomly in the form of Cloudian Aerosol, which allows you to discard a Cloudian monster to place a number of fog counters on any face-up monster on the field equal to that Cloudian's level. So if you discard something like Cloudian Eye of the Typhoon, a level 8 Cloudian monster, then you can immediately place 8 cloud counters onto one of your opponent's monsters, and then finally be able to destroy it with Diamond Dust Cyclone in order to draw 2 cards. Although in that whole exchange, you're spending 3 cards from your hand to draw 2 cards while only removing a single card your opponent controls, which is only card neutral in advantage. The same card advantage as activating Upstart Goblin. Upstart Goblin's not half bad, but it doesn't require you to play 3 specific cards to get that effect. Diamond Dust Cyclone is just one of those cards that's good in theory and probably a lot more better in casual play, where your Cloudians are actually living long enough to accumulate a lot of fog counters. But it completely falls apart in any kind of competitive play, and is not really worth playing if you want to play a Cloudian deck, unless you have some really good cloud stall strategy, and you're going to be placing fog counters like crazy with Cloudian Squall. And at number 8, we have Human Wave Tactics. This is a card that allows you to special summon any number of level 2 or lower normal monsters from your deck, up to the number of level 2 or lower normal monsters that were destroyed by battle during the end phase. So if you had 5 level 2 or lower normal monsters, and all 5 of them were destroyed by battle, then you can special summon 5 monsters from your deck during the end phase. Now, I'm not really sure if this counts as card neutral in card advantage, or if it's actually the potential to go +5 in card advantage, because you are getting 5 monsters out of the deck with level 2 or lower normal monsters, who are actually quite easy to swarm on the field, with stuff like the League of Uniform Nomenclature, Tri-White, Enchanted Fitting Room, Treasure Panda, and Overlimit. Technically, it could be card neutral, or a +1 for each destruction because you were going to lose them anyway, but either way, it fits the spirit of this list even if it might have issues in its technicalities on the card advantage front. So, what's wrong with human wave tactics? Well, it requires you to have level 2 or lower normal monsters on the field that live long enough to get destroyed by battle, and also have this card stay on the field long enough to resolve during the end phase. It only replaces normal monsters that are destroyed by battle, and generally, normal monsters don't stay around long enough to be destroyed by battle, as they're generally used as link climbing tools or for a number of extra deck focus plays. And even if you do have some monsters that stay around long enough to get destroyed, it would probably be best worked with tokens getting destroyed by battle, since they can count as normal monsters and most of them are level 2 or lower. It sounds like an excellent card in theory, but in practice it's just too slow. It relies on your opponent to not destroy all your cards with card effects, which is how most cards are removed from the game anyway in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! If you're playing in a really slow casual setting where destruction effects are rare and you're going into grind games, then Human Wave Tactics might be a fun addition to a low-tiered Law of the Normal deck. This is one of my favorite decks to play against friends in high school, but not because I was trying to win, because I was trying to play a dumb deck that would occasionally pull off a fun win. Because there's so many better cards that interact with level 2 or lower monsters like I described earlier, there's no reason to play Human Wave Tactics because it's just slower than all of them. And at number 7, we have Tongue Twister. This is a level 6 monster with incredibly low stats that has the effect that if this card is tribute summoned, when it's sent from the field to the graveyard, you get to draw 2 cards and remove from play this card. So technically a +1 in card advantage, depending on how this card is removed from the field. There are some ways to make use of this card actually, like if you're playing a Hieratic deck, and use it as a combo piece in order to go into auto-matic to Vulcan. But generally, you're better off just using other Hieratic cards and not bothering with Tongue Twister. Now, the problems with this card is it's just a little bit too difficult to use and make good use of. You have to tribute summon this card and then find a way to use it as material for something else because it's useless on its own. And as we've seen with Monarch decks, getting tribute summon monsters out is kind of difficult unless they have an archetype that supplements it heavily, like True Dracos. And Tongue Twister is part of no such archetype. It's just full of potential. Maybe one day there'll be an archetype that's able to easily search and bring out Tongue Twister and turn that +1 into an amazing advantage. But currently, it's mainly a gimmick outside of Hieratic shenanigans, and kind of hard to use and will probably just end up being a brick in your hand most of the time. And at number 6, we have Alchemy Cycle. This is a trap card which has the effect that it turns the original attack of all face-up monsters you control to become 0 until the end phase. Then, each time a monster who's had its attack reduced with this effect is destroyed by battle, you get to draw 1 card. So if you have a full board of monsters in defense position, all of which had at least more than 0 attacks so they could be lowered with this card, and then your opponent destroys them all by battle, you could draw up to 6 cards, which is kind of the same restrictions as Human Wave Tactics, where technically you're just replacing cards that are being destroyed, but you're replacing cards that normally wouldn't replace themselves at all. So it could be argued to be a +5 in card advantage, or a -1. Whatever the case, the reason why this card doesn't see play is basically because it banks on the fact that you have a board set up of monsters who are ready to get destroyed by battle, and you won't lose the duel immediately by having them all set to 0. And you'd probably have to have enough cards in the field that have floating effects, that way you'd actually be able to get a whole bunch of use out of that advantage. So if you have a full board of monsters like Yang Zings, I think you could use this card in order to draw a whole bunch of cards while replacing your field, unless that causes the Yang Zings to miss timing, because they infamously miss timing pretty easily. I don't know, I didn't really check for this video. Although most of the time your opponent will just wipe out all your cards before the battle phase, where you won't have enough time to get out cards during the battle phase where something like this would give you a significant advantage. And it's useless half the time as well. It has pretty specific situational usefulness, which kind of requires you to go out of your way in order to set it up so that you don't lose during that battle phase. And if you do have a full board of cards set up that would allow you to gain a whole bunch of advantage from Alchemy Cycle, your opponent can just choose to skip the battle phase and not attack anything past the 1 card that you might have activated this to, making most of that advantage moot. So, for how hard it is to actually set this card up in its best possible way, it's also easy to counter by just not attacking. And this card is pretty high on my list of cards that I've always wanted to make useful in a deck but could never find a gimmick deck that could make full use of it, without it just being a dead card most of the time. And at number 5, we have Black and White Wave. This is a quick play spell card which has the effect that if you control an Xyz monster that has a Synchro monster as one of its materials, you can banish one card on the field and then draw one card. So the hardest thing to use with Black and White Wave is the activation requirement. Have an Xyz monster with one of its materials being a Synchro monster. But if you meet the requirements, you get a full +1 in card advantage, as you're removing one card from the field while also drawing a card to replace the card you're using from your hand. And a quick play spell card that's able to banish and draw a card, that's really good. This card is actually like a really good effect. The problem lies entirely in its activation requirement, where there are very few decks that naturally allow you to use Synchro monsters as Xyz materials, and you'd kind of have to build your deck around this card in order to make it work. And that's just not good enough to build your deck around. Unless you're playing something like Virtual Worlds, they're actually really good in going to Xyz monsters that have Synchro monsters as the materials. But they would not play this card either because they're basically a combo deck, and this is more of a control-oriented card. They could use it, sure, but if they were to use a card that could situationally pop one card on the field, they would probably want something they could use no matter what game state they had. So even a deck that could use this card, it would only be a win more card, and wouldn't help you establish that board state in the first place, which is why it doesn't see competitive play, even though there is a top meta deck that can actually make use of the card pretty easily. Generally, win more cards are just not super useful. And at number 4, we have Nitro Synchron. This is a level 2 Synchron monster, which has the effect that if it's sent to the graveyard for a Synchro summon of a Nitro Synchro monster, you get to draw one card. And there is actually a Synchro monster which requires this card as one of its materials, Nitro Warrior. In fact, the only Nitro Synchro monster in the game. You can see they had plans to make more, but didn't for some reason that will probably be obvious as we explain the rest of the card. However, Nitro Warrior itself actually saw a lot of competitive play over the years, since it has the ability to attack twice and can boost its attack to around 3,800. Although, funny enough, none of the competitive decks that use Nitro Warrior played a single copy of Nitro Synchron. The card was 100% brought out with Quick Draw Synchron. Quick Draw Synchron is a level 5 tuner monster that can special summon itself from your hand by discarding one other monster, and has a special ability where it can be substituted as any one Synchron tuner monster for the synchro summon of a monster that requires a specific Synchron tuner, like Nitro Warrior does. And the reason Quick Draw Synchron was played over Nitro Synchron is because it could special summon itself from the hand, which is much more useful. Sure, Nitro Synchron technically allows you to go +1 with its granted effect, but only if it's used for a Nitro Synchro monster, and it doesn't really have any utility outside of that. Quick Draw Synchron is just much more versatile and has a distinction where it's a tuner monster that can special summon itself from the hand, which is way more valuable than drawing a card on a Synchro summon. Quick Draw Synchron can actually extend combo plays, whereas Nitro Synchron would probably be the only play, or you'd have to expend extra resources to get on the field outside of your normal summon. Its +1 effect is just a little bit too weak for it to be useful, and its specific Synchro monster isn't strong enough where you'd want to play it with anything else besides Quick Draw Synchron. That card was basically just an option in the extra deck and not really the whole focus of Quick Draw Synchron decks. And at number 3, we have Arcane Barrier. This is a continuous spell card which has the effect that each time a spellcaster monster in the field is destroyed, you get to place one spell counter on this card. Then you can send this card and one face of spellcaster monster you control to the graveyard in order to draw one card for each spell counter that was on this card. And this card can hold a maximum of 4 spell counters. So you can send this card and a spellcaster to the graveyard with its maximum amount, and that's a +2 in card advantage. And here's why this doesn't see play. That's just a little bit too slow. The only way for this card to gain spell counters on its own power is when a spellcaster type monster is destroyed, and kind of falls into the same problems as Alchemy Cycle or Human Wave Tactics, where you either just have to wait for the cards to get destroyed naturally, or find a way to destroy them yourselves. There are ways to accomplish this, sure. You could bring out the 4 spell counters and just destroy them all with Dark Hole in order to immediately grant this card the 4 spell counters. That would be really stupid unless you were going to gain some other advantage from those 4 cards. There are cards that can move spell counters around on the field as well, but none of them are efficient enough to fuel this card with its maximum amount in a timely manner. That wouldn't be better spent on just other spell counter cards. Even a powerhouse like Spell Power Mastery requires a bit of resources in the graveyard before you're able to place 4 spell counters on it with 1 card. And there's also the cost where you still need to send a spellcaster monster you control to the graveyard in order to even use its effect to draw cards. So even after going through the trouble of getting 4 spell counters on it, you still also need to get a spellcaster monster on the field that you're willing to send to the graveyard, which is just enough of a hindrance, where it seems like it would be good advantage, kind of like Shard of Greed, but it's just a little bit too slow and cumbersome in order to gain that advantage. And so it just doesn't see any play, and is also super likely of just being destroyed before you get the 4 spell counters going anyway. And at number 2, we have 3-Hump Lacooda. This is a level 3 beast monster who has the effect that if there are 3 face-up copies of this card on your side of the field, you contribute 2 of them in order to draw 3 cards. So technically a +1 in card advantage. And this card actually does have a way to get this combo out a little bit easier. If you already have 1 of these copies on the field, you could actually just use Rescue Cat in order to get the other 2 copies out directly from your deck. Then you'd only need 1 of them to have their effect alive in order to tribute the other 2 in order to draw 3 cards. The problem with all of that is the amount of effort required in order to accomplish that feat, which just isn't super consistent, and a +1 is not enough of an incentive to try to pull that off. If there was a 1-card way to get these 3 cards in the field, that might be useful, kind of like Evil Thorn, and how it can special summon 2 other copies of itself from the deck, and is technically a +1 in card advantage, and did see competitive play in the OCG. 3-Hump Lacooda, though, really needs help from other cards in order to accomplish its +1, and doesn't really do anything else. It's kind of a low-statted level 3 beast-type monster that you need to spend a whole bunch of resources to get the 3 copies on the field of. But if you are trying to pull this effect off for whatever reason, outside of the Rescue Cat method, you could also get the other copies on the field pretty easily with Infernal Reckless Summon, which would still require you to special summon 1 copy in some other inconvenient way in order to meet the conditions for Infernal Reckless Summon. But it would also give your opponent a couple extra monsters and is probably not worth it, but it is a way to use its effect easily if you want to pull off an inconsistent draw engine. And at number 1, we have Spacian Twinkle Moss. This card has the effect that when it's involved in a battle, you get to draw 1 card, and then reveal the card in order to apply an effect based on the type of card you drew, where if it's a monster card, the battle phase is ended immediately. If it's a spell card, then this card can declare a direct attack, if it was the one attacking. And if it's a trap card, this card is changed to defense position. So if your deck is full of nothing but monsters, you can just continuously end the battle phase anytime your opponent tries to attack into this card, or just draw an extra card on your turn by attacking. This card is easily a +1 in advantage if you're able to pull off its effect 2 times, as the conditions for bringing this card out have to use a spell card next on a Spacian Glow Moss you control. And funny thing about Spacian Twinkle Moss, this card's name is also treated as Spacian Glow Moss, as in exactly the same name. So if you want to bring this card out and have a single copy of it in your extra deck, you can only play 2 copies of Spacian Glow Moss in your main deck, because then you run into the 3 cards in your deck with the same name rule. So this fusion monster directly impacts the consistency at which it can be brought out. And the card you need in order to bring this card out is unsearchable, or at the very least unsearchable with archetype specific searchers. It can technically be searched out with any card that can search out a normal spell card, which is generally one of the hardest types of cards to search out. So if you're going through the effort of trying to bring this card out, what you get is an incredibly low-statted fusion monster with 0 protections outside of the battle phase shenanigans, that can potentially give you a lot of advantage if it stays on the field long enough to declare a whole bunch of attacks. That is to say, not super useful, and also easily one of the worst cards that technically gives you card advantage, if it survives long enough to give you that advantage anyway. It's too hard to bring out, its effect directly makes it more inconsistent to bring out, it has really low stats, and dies to any form of removal. Alright, and that's the list. Some of these cards might have been a stretch, some of them might even have some super useful thing I hadn't thought about, so if you think I missed something important or have ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.